Hello, amazing viewers. Before we dive into this incredible true story of courage and determination, don't forget to subscribe to Silent Human Greeting and hit that notification bell so you never miss our videos and help our content reach more people who love powerful human stories like this one. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Campbell, Kentucky, as Sarah Chen stood at attention in the Medical Review Board's sterile conference room. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, creating an almost clinical atmosphere that felt all too familiar to the 28-year-old former combat medic. Her dress uniform was impeccable, each ribbon and badge perfectly aligned, but none of that mattered now. "Sergeant Chen," Colonel Martinez began, his voice carrying the weight of difficult decisions. "Your service record speaks for itself. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 3 Purple Hearts, and countless lives saved under fire. But we have to face the reality of your current physical limitations." Sarah's left shoulder throbbed, a constant reminder of the IED blast that had changed everything 6 months ago. The shrapnel had been removed, the bones had healed, but the nerve damage was permanent. Her left arm could only lift to shoulder height, and gripping anything heavier than a coffee cup for extended periods sent shooting pains down her spine. "Sir, with respect," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I've adapted my techniques. I can still perform medical duties, and my strategic thinking doesn't carry a wounded soldier to safety," interrupted Major Harrison, the medical officer who had been pushing for her discharge. "In the field, when lives are on the line, we need personnel who are 100% physically capable. You're a liability now, Sergeant." The words hit harder than any shrapnel ever could. Sarah had dedicated 8 years of her life to the Army, had pulled dozens of wounded soldiers from harm's way, had earned the respect of every unit she'd served with. Now, because of one moment, one explosion that she couldn't control, it was all being stripped away. "The board's decision is final," Colonel Martinez concluded, though his expression suggested he took no pleasure in it. "You'll be honorably discharged with full benefits and a commendation for your years of exemplary service." "I'm sorry, Sarah. I truly am." As Sarah walked out of that conference room for the last time, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, she felt something die inside her. The identity she'd built, the purpose that had driven her through the darkest moments of combat, all of it was being classified as unfit for duty. 3 months later, Sarah found herself in downtown Chicago, staring up at the gleaming facade of Meridian International, a multinational consulting firm that had offered her a position as a security consultant. The irony wasn't lost on her. They valued her military experience and strategic mind enough to hire her, but the Army had deemed those same qualities insufficient. Her boss, James Williamson, a former Marine-turned-corporate executive, had been one of the few people who saw past her physical limitations. "You've got something most of these corporate security guys don't have," he'd told her during the interview. "You've seen real danger. You know how people react under pressure. That's worth more than being able to bench press your body weight." The job was decent, reviewing security protocols, conducting threat assessments, training executives on emergency procedures. It wasn't saving lives on the battlefield, but it was honest work. Sarah threw herself into it with the same dedication she'd brought to the Army, earning respect from colleagues and clients alike. But late at night, alone in her small apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, Sarah would stare out at the dark water and wonder if this was all there was now. Had her best days truly ended in that Afghan desert? Was she destined to spend the rest of her career in air-conditioned boardrooms, discussing theoretical threats that would likely never materialize? The physical therapy sessions continued 3 times a week. Sarah pushed herself harder than her doctors recommended, hoping against hope that somehow she might regain full function in her arm. The pain was intense, but it paled in comparison to the ache in her heart, the loss of the life she'd built, and the identity that had defined her. "You need to accept your new reality," her therapist, Dr. Patricia Reeves, had told her during one particularly difficult session. "Your body has changed, Sarah. That doesn't make you less capable. It makes you different. The question is, what are you going to do with that difference?" Sarah had nodded politely, but inside, she'd rejected the notion. She wasn't ready to accept limitations. She wasn't ready to be anything less than the soldier she'd always been. As autumn gave way to winter, Sarah settled into her routine at Meridian International. She arrived early, stayed late, and threw herself into every project with military precision. Her colleagues respected her expertise, but she could sense their careful politeness, the way they subtly avoided assigning her any tasks that might strain her injured arm, the concerned glances when they thought she wasn't looking. She was competent, valued even, but she was no longer the person she'd once been. The woman who had crawled through Taliban fire to reach wounded soldiers, who had performed emergency surgery in the back of a moving Humvee, who had earned the nickname Guardian Angel from her unit, that woman felt like a ghost from another life. But sometimes, in quiet moments between meetings or during her evening walks along the lakefront, Sarah felt something stirring inside her, a restlessness, a sense that her story wasn't over yet. She'd learned to live with her physical limitations, had even found ways to work around them, but she hadn't yet discovered what her new purpose might be. The corporate world was safe, predictable, comfortable, but Sarah Chen had never been built for comfort. Deep down, beneath the professional facade and the acceptance of her new reality, the warrior in her was still very much alive, waiting, watching, and preparing for a moment that would test everything she thought she'd lost. The morning of March 15th started like any other Tuesday at Meridian International. Sarah arrived at the office at 6:30 a.m., her usual time, carrying her coffee and laptop bag while carefully managing the weight distribution to avoid straining her injured shoulder. The Chicago skyline was painted in soft pastels as dawn broke over Lake Michigan, and the city was just beginning to stir with the morning rush hour. The 47-story Meridian Tower was one of downtown Chicago's most impressive buildings, housing not just her company, but dozens of other international businesses. Today was particularly significant. The Global Security Summit was being held on the 23rd floor, bringing together executives from 15 different countries to discuss emerging threats in corporate security. Sarah had spent weeks preparing for this conference. As the lead consultant on the project, she'd reviewed security protocols for each visiting executive, coordinated with local law enforcement, and even personally inspected every entry point to the building. Her military training had taught her to think like an adversary, to identify weaknesses before they could be exploited. "Chen, you've outdone yourself," James Williamson had said the night before, reviewing her comprehensive security assessment. "This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we needed. These executives will be safer here than in their own homes." But as Sarah rode the elevator to the 23rd floor that morning, something felt off. Her combat-honed instincts, the ones that had kept her alive through 2 deployments, were sending subtle warning signals she couldn't quite identify. The building's security guards seemed more numerous than usual, and she'd noticed several service vehicles in the underground garage that weren't part of her scheduled maintenance reports. The conference room was already buzzing with activity when she arrived. 15 executives from companies spanning 6 continents were reviewing presentation materials, their conversations a mixture of English, Mandarin, German, and Spanish. Sarah recognized each face from the briefing files. Maria Santos from Brazil's largest mining company, Dmitry Volkov from a Russian energy conglomerate, Chen Wei-ming from Taiwan's tech sector, and 12 others who collectively represented billions in international commerce. "Sarah," James approached with his characteristic enthusiasm, "everything looks perfect. The folks from State Department Security were impressed with your threat assessment. They said it was more thorough than what some embassies get." Sarah smiled, but that nagging feeling persisted. She excused herself and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. From the 23rd floor, Chicago stretched out below like a complex circuit board, with the morning sun casting long shadows between the skyscrapers. Everything appeared normal, traffic flowing, pedestrians moving along the sidewalks, the usual rhythm of urban life. At exactly 9:47 a.m., as the opening presentations were beginning, Sarah heard something that made her blood run cold, the distinctive sound of tactical boots on marble flooring, moving with military precision. Her head snapped toward the conference room entrance just as 6 figures in black tactical gear burst through the doors. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The casual business atmosphere evaporated as automatic weapons appeared. Shouted commands filled the air, and the 15 executives who had been discussing quarterly projections moments earlier were suddenly on their knees with their hands behind their heads. Sarah had been standing near the windows when the intrusion began, partially hidden by a decorative pillar. Her first instinct was to move, to act, to do something, but her training kicked in instead. Assess first, then act. Never reveal your position until you understand the full tactical situation. The leader of the group, a tall man with a distinctive scar running from his left ear to his jaw, spoke with a slight accent she couldn't immediately place. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are now under the protection of the Liberation Front for Global Justice. You will not be harmed if our demands are met. You will remain here until the governments of your respective countries agree to certain policy adjustments." Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. 6 attackers, at least she could see. Automatic weapons, AK-47 variants from the sound when one of them chambered a round. They'd obviously obviously planned this carefully, bypassing building security and timing their approach perfectly. This wasn't a random act of violence, it was a coordinated political operation. From her concealed position, Sarah could see that the terrorists had positioned themselves strategically around the room. Two near the main entrance, two covering the windows, one watching the hostages, and the leader coordinating. Professional, disciplined, dangerous. Her phone was in her jacket pocket, but reaching for it would risk revealing her position. She needed to think like a soldier again, not a corporate consultant. What were her assets? What were her limitations? What would the next hour look like if she did nothing? Through the windows, she could already see police cars arriving on the street below. Someone had triggered an alarm, or perhaps the building's security had noticed the intruders on their cameras. But Sarah knew from experience that police response to hostage situations was cautious and methodical. It could be hours before they attempted any kind of rescue operation, and by then, she watched as Maria Santos, the Brazilian executive, tried to quietly comfort Chen Wei-ming, who was visibly shaking. These weren't soldiers or trained security personnel. They were business people, smart, successful, but completely unprepared for this level of violence and intimidation. The building is now surrounded, the scarred leader announced, apparently receiving information through an earpiece. Excellent. This will ensure that our message reaches the appropriate audiences. Sarah's shoulder throbbed as adrenaline flooded her system. The pain that had defined her limitations for the past year suddenly seemed irrelevant. These people, her colleagues, her responsibility, were in immediate danger. The same instinct that had driven her to run toward explosions rather than away from them was surging back to life, but she wasn't the same person who had served in Afghanistan. Her body was different now, her capabilities limited. Could she really make a difference? Or would attempting to help only make things worse? As if responding to her internal debate, one of the hostages, James Williamson, the man who had given her a second chance when the army cast her aside, caught her eye from across the room. His expression was calm but urgent, and his slight nod seemed to say, "I trust you. Do what you do best." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The same weight she'd carried through the mountains of Afghanistan, the same burden that had driven her to save lives under impossible circumstances. Her body might be different now, but her mind, her tactical thinking, her ability to see solutions where others saw only problems, that was still intact. When she opened her eyes, Sarah Chen was no longer just a security consultant with physical limitations. She was a soldier again, and these 15 innocent people were her mission. The real question wasn't whether she was fit for duty. The question was whether duty was ready for who she had become. For the next 2 hours, Sarah remained perfectly still behind the decorative pillar, watching and learning. Every detail mattered now. The terrorists' patrol patterns, their communication methods, the positioning of the hostages, the layout of the room she knew so well from her security assessments. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the police response growing. SWAT vehicles had arrived, snipers were being positioned on nearby buildings, and news helicopters circled like mechanical vultures. But Sarah knew the reality of hostage situations. The longer they dragged on, the more dangerous they became for everyone inside. The terrorists' leader, who the others called Commander, had established communication with authorities. His demands were complex: the release of political prisoners in 3 different countries, policy changes regarding international trade agreements, and safe passage for his team. Sarah recognized the pattern. These weren't achievable short-term demands. He was buying time, which meant this situation could last days. At 12:15 p.m., everything changed. "The authorities are not negotiating in good faith," Commander announced to his team. "Prepare to send a message." Sarah's blood ran cold as one of the terrorists roughly grabbed Maria Santos, the Brazilian executive, and forced her toward the windows where television cameras could capture the scene. The intent was clear and unacceptable. This was the moment Sarah had been unconsciously preparing for since the attack began. She'd studied every aspect of the room, noting that the terrorists had made one crucial oversight: the building's ventilation system. During her security assessment weeks earlier, Sarah had crawled through every access point in the building, including the large HVAC ducts that connected each floor. Her smaller stature, something she'd always been self-conscious about in the army, had been an advantage then, and it would be now. Moving with the silent precision that had kept her alive in Afghanistan, Sarah slipped away from her hiding spot and into the hallway. The building's emergency lighting cast eerie shadows as she made her way to the maintenance room she'd identified during her earlier security work. Her left shoulder screamed in protest as she removed the ventilation grate, but she'd learned to work through pain over the past year. The duct was cramped and uncomfortable, but it provided access to every room on the floor, including several positions directly above the conference room. As she crawled through the narrow space, Sarah's mind shifted into the tactical mode she'd thought was lost forever. She mentally cataloged every piece of information she'd gathered. 6 terrorists, at least 2 with military training based on their movement patterns, automatic weapons but no obvious explosives despite their earlier threats, and 15 hostages who were becoming increasingly traumatized as the hours passed. Her first objective was intelligence gathering. Through a ventilation grate directly above the conference room, she could observe the entire situation. The terrorists had grown more agitated over the past hour, and their discipline was beginning to slip. 2 of them were arguing about the police response, while another was clearly struggling with the stress of the situation. But it was what she saw next that changed everything. Commander was no longer just making threats, he was preparing to follow through on them. Maria Santos was being positioned as a demonstration of resolve, and Sarah could see the cold calculation in his eyes. This wasn't about politics anymore, it was about maintaining control through fear. Sarah had minutes, maybe less, before an innocent woman died. Her combat experience had taught her that in situations like this, the greatest advantage was surprise. The terrorists expected threats from outside the building. Police, SWAT teams, snipers. They weren't watching for someone already inside their perimeter. Using her knowledge of the building's infrastructure, Sarah mapped out her approach. The conference room's dropped ceiling provided access points. The emergency lighting system could be manipulated from the electrical room down the hall. And the sprinkler system. That was the key. 23 minutes later, as Commander raised his weapon toward Maria Santos, every sprinkler head in the conference room activated simultaneously. The chaos was immediate and overwhelming. Water cascaded from the ceiling, emergency alarms blared, and the terrorists' carefully controlled environment dissolved into confusion. In the same instant, Sarah dropped through a ceiling tile directly behind the 2 guards positioned near the entrance. Her injured left arm might not have full strength, but her right arm was perfect, and her knowledge of pressure points and combat techniques was unchanged. The first terrorist went down without firing a shot, disabled by a precisely applied chokehold that cut off blood flow to his brain. The second spun toward her, but Sarah was already moving, using his own momentum against him to drive him into the wall, with a technique she'd adapted specifically to work with her physical limitations. 2 down, 4 to go. What the hell? Commander's shout was cut short as Sarah dove behind an overturned conference table, bullets splintering the wood above her head. The hostages were screaming. Water was everywhere, and the remaining terrorists were trying to regain control of a situation that had devolved into complete chaos. But chaos was exactly what Sarah needed. She'd spent months learning to work around her limitations, developing new techniques that relied on intelligence and precision rather than brute strength. Now, as she moved through the water-soaked conference room like a ghost, those adaptations became her greatest weapons. The third terrorist fell to an improvised weapon Sarah had crafted from office supplies, a combination of cable ties and metal letter openers that created an effective restraint system. The fourth was taken down when Sarah used the building's own infrastructure against him, triggering a section of the dropped ceiling to collapse at precisely the right moment. Commander and his remaining associate had managed to corner 5 of the hostages near the windows, using them as human shields while trying to regain tactical control. But Sarah had spent the past year learning that sometimes the greatest strength came from acknowledging weakness and finding new ways to overcome obstacles. "You have nowhere to go," Commander shouted, his earlier composure completely shattered. "Show yourself or these people die." Sarah's response came not as words but as action. Using the building's emergency communication system, she activated the floor's public address speakers with a message that sent chills through everyone present. "This is Sergeant Sarah Chen, United States Army. You are surrounded, your escape routes are compromised, and your tactical advantage is gone. Release the hostages now, and no one else needs to get hurt." The psychological effect was immediate. The terrorists hadn't just lost physical control, they'd lost the fear factor that had been their primary weapon. They were no longer fighting helpless business executives. They were facing a trained soldier who had turned their own operation against them. What happened in the next 14 minutes would be talked about in tactical training circles for years to come. Sarah Chen, the woman the Army had declared unfit for duty, had just proven that fitness came in many forms, and sometimes the most dangerous opponent was someone who had learned to fight differently, not just harder. Hello, amazing viewers. Before we witness the incredible conclusion of Sarah's story, don't forget to subscribe to Silent Human Greeting and hit that notification bell so you never miss our videos and help our content reach more people who love powerful human stories like this one. The announcement over the building's PA system had transformed the entire dynamic of the hostage situation. Commander and his remaining associate, Victor, found themselves facing not a group of helpless business executives, but a trained military operative who had systematically dismantled their operation from the inside. Impossible, Victor muttered in heavily accented English, his automatic weapon sweeping nervously across the room. The building was secured. We cleared every floor. But Sarah had learned something during her months of physical therapy and adaptation that her military training hadn't taught her. Sometimes being underestimated was the greatest tactical advantage of all. From her position behind the overturned conference table, Sarah could see that the 5 remaining hostages, including James Williamson, were clustered near the windows where Commander was using them as shields. The other 10 hostages had taken cover behind office furniture when the sprinklers activated, and she needed to get them to safety before making her final move. Using hand signals she'd learned in Afghanistan, Sarah communicated with the hidden hostages. Chen Wei-ming, the Taiwanese tech executive, was closest to the emergency exit. His eyes were wide with terror, but he nodded when Sarah indicated he should move toward the door when she created the next distraction. The distraction came in a form that would have been impossible for the old Sarah Chen, the one who relied purely on physical strength and standard military tactics. This Sarah had learned to think creatively, to use her limitations as assets rather than obstacles. The conference room's smartboard system was still connected to the building's network. Using her phone, Sarah accessed the building's environmental controls, something she'd learned to do during her security assessments. With a few keystrokes, she triggered the emergency lighting system to strobe, activated the building's fire suppression CO2 system in the adjacent rooms to create noise and confusion, and sent every elevator in the building to the 23rd floor simultaneously. The cacophony was overwhelming. Strobe lights, alarm sounds, the mechanical noise of multiple elevators arriving, and the hiss of CO2 systems created sensory overload that masked the movement of hostages toward the emergency exits. In the chaos, Sarah moved. Her approach to the final 2 terrorists wasn't the direct assault she might have attempted in her army days. Instead, it was a carefully choreographed sequence that used every advantage her new reality provided. She was smaller, quieter, and more precise than she'd ever been as a soldier. Victor was the first to fall. Sarah had noticed during her observation that he favored his right side when turning, probably an old injury that affected his mobility. She used this against him, approaching from his blind spot and using a compression hold on his carotid artery that rendered him unconscious in seconds. His weapon clattered to the floor as he collapsed. Commander was more dangerous. As the leader, he'd maintained better discipline throughout the crisis, and Sarah could see in his eyes that he recognized what was happening. This was no longer about politics or hostages. This was about survival. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he snarled, pressing his weapon against James Williamson's head. "Come out where I can see you, soldier, or your boss dies." Sarah stepped into view, her hands visible but not raised. She'd learned something crucial during her months of civilian life. Sometimes the most powerful weapon was simply being unafraid. "I'm not a hero," she said calmly, her voice carrying the authority she'd earned through years of making life and death decisions under pressure. "I'm just someone who's learned that being different doesn't mean being less capable." What happened next unfolded in a matter of seconds, but it represented the culmination of everything Sarah had learned about adaptation, resilience, and finding new ways to serve. Commander's attention was focused on her words, but Sarah's real communication was happening through her positioning. She'd moved to a spot where the strobing emergency lights created a specific shadow pattern, one that would confuse depth perception for exactly 1.2 seconds when the sequence repeated. In that 1.2-second window, Sarah moved with precision that surprised even her. Her injured left arm couldn't grip effectively, but it could still redirect and deflect. Her right arm had become stronger than it had ever been, compensated for her left side's limitations, and her tactical mind had learned to see solutions that relied on timing and intelligence rather than brute force. The weapon flew from Commander's hands as Sarah's deflection technique sent it skittering across the wet floor. Before he could react, she'd applied a restraint hold that used his own body weight against him, a technique she'd developed specifically to work with her physical limitations. 47 minutes after the crisis began, the 23rd floor of Meridian Tower was secure. All 15 hostages were safe and uninjured. All 6 terrorists were in custody, and Sarah Chen, the woman who'd been declared unfit for duty, had just executed one of the most successful civilian hostage rescues in Chicago's history. The aftermath was a blur of paramedics, FBI agents, news cameras, and debriefings that lasted well into the night. But for Sarah, the most meaningful moment came when James Williamson, after giving his statement to authorities, found her sitting quietly in a corner of the emergency command center. "The Army doesn't know what they lost when they let you go," he said simply. Sarah looked up at him, exhaustion evident in her eyes. Maybe they knew exactly what they were doing. Maybe I needed to lose that version of myself to become this one. 3 weeks later, Sarah received a phone call that would change her life once again. It was Colonel Martinez, the same officer who had delivered her discharge papers a year earlier. "Sarah," his voice carried a tone she'd never heard before, respect mixed with something that might have been awe. "I've been following the news coverage of what happened in Chicago. The Army, we made a mistake. A big one." He paused, and Sarah could hear papers shuffling in the background. "We're creating a new unit, urban tactical operations, hostage rescue, situations that require unconventional approaches. We need someone to develop the training protocols, someone who understands that fitness for duty comes in many forms. The position comes with a promotion to captain and full reinstatement of benefits." Sarah stared out her apartment window at Lake Michigan, where the morning sun was painting the water in shades of gold and silver. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, strong, capable, but limited by conventional thinking about what it meant to be a soldier. "There's one condition," she said finally. "Name it. The unit isn't just for soldiers who've been injured or deemed unfit. It's for anyone who thinks differently, who can see solutions that others miss. Sometimes the most dangerous warrior is someone who's learned to fight with their mind instead of just their muscles." Colonel Martinez was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Captain Chen, I think that's exactly what we need. When can you start?" Sarah smiled, feeling pieces of herself falling back into place. Not the same pieces as before, but something new and stronger. "I've been ready my whole life, sir. I just didn't know it yet." 6 months later, Captain Sarah Chen stood before her first class of recruits at the newly established Urban Tactical Operations Center at Fort Bragg. The 30 soldiers in front of her represented a cross-section of military personnel who'd been written off by conventional standards, soldiers with physical limitations, tactical thinkers who didn't fit traditional molds, and individuals who'd learned to turn their perceived weaknesses into operational strengths. "My name is Captain Chen," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd proven that duty came in many forms. "I was once told I was unfit for service because of a physical limitation. What I learned is that being told you can't do something is just the first step toward proving that you can do it better than anyone thought possible." She gestured to the training facility around them. Obstacle courses designed for adaptive techniques, simulation rooms for unconventional scenarios, and equipment that emphasized intelligence and precision over brute strength. "You're here not despite your differences, but because of them. The military has spent decades training soldiers to be the same, to meet identical standards, to respond with identical techniques, to think in identical patterns. But the threats we face today require something different. They require soldiers who can see solutions that others miss, who can adapt when standard procedures fail, who can turn limitations into advantages." Sarah paused, looking into the faces of soldiers who'd been told they weren't enough, weren't strong enough, weren't fast enough, weren't fit enough for duty. The enemy expects us to respond in predictable ways. They prepare for conventional tactics, standard approaches, traditional strengths. What they don't expect is a soldier who's learned to fight differently, someone who uses intelligence instead of just force, precision instead of just power, creativity instead of just protocol. She walked among the recruits, seeing in each face the same mixture of doubt and determination she'd carried for so many months. "Over the next 6 months, you're going to learn that fitness for duty isn't about meeting someone else's definition of capability. It's about maximizing your own unique strengths while finding innovative ways to overcome your limitations. You're going to discover that sometimes the most effective warrior is someone who's learned to think like a warrior, not just fight like one." As the morning sun streamed through the training facility's windows, Captain Sarah Chen looked at her recruits and saw something the military establishment was just beginning to understand. The future of warfare wouldn't be won by soldiers who were all the same, but by those who were courageously, strategically, and effectively different. The woman who'd been called unfit for duty had not only proven her own worth, she'd redefined what duty itself could look like, and in doing so, she'd shown that sometimes the greatest victories come not from overcoming our limitations, but from transforming them into our greatest strengths. Thank you for joining us for this incredible story of resilience, courage, and the power of redefining what it means to be strong. Captain Sarah Chen's journey reminds us that our perceived limitations often hide our greatest potential. Don't forget to subscribe to Silent Human Greeting for more inspiring stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary extraordinary things. Until next time, remember, being different isn't a weakness, it's your secret weapon.